feel like a right doing this, but here we go.
Well, good morning, everybody. And how many mistakes did I make on the first sort of couple of minutes? Hopefully, you saw the screen and you saw the video that we were hoping to play to you. So thank you for coming along to another webinar. My name is James Sambrook. I'm Joe's friend and business partner. You may have met me in Birmingham, Manchester, or London, or one of the previous webinars. Joe sets a pretty high standard for these webinars. So let's make this an amazing one for him, and so I can, he doesn't sack me from the job. So first of all, the chat feature that I can see loads of you are saying good morning in. Make sure you switch it to all panelists and attendees, so that everybody can see the chat and you can have your own little conversation whilst George and I are running the webinar. Put in there where you're from, and it's always interesting to see. We've got lots of people logging in. We've got Bolton, Edinburgh, Naples, Italy, good morning, and Norwich, so there's a good Derbyshire, nice one. If you've got questions for George throughout this morning, make sure you use the Q&A feature and pop those in there, and we'll answer those at the end. And usually the questions that get in there earlier tend to get upvoted, and we sort of see those answered earlier on in the webinar. So Joe is currently on his way to my house, actually, which is why I'm here. This afternoon we're heading off to a very exciting brand to go and make a video to bring you some behind the scenes content for a brand that I can't wait to share with you, and to give you a bit of a different perspective on the industry. So yeah, that's why I'm running it this morning. You may have also seen, if you follow myself or Joe or the Marketing Meetup on LinkedIn, you may have seen that we made our first hire in the last couple of weeks. Her name's Eleanor, and Elle has already made a huge difference to Joe and I and our organisation. She's jumped straight into TMM Plus, which hopefully some of you know about, and she's uploaded a bunch of new content, and she's helping organise the Mentor programme as well, which is going to be live in the new year. So that's all in TMM Plus. So if you wanted to go and check that out, that's on our website. And yeah, there's lots going on. We've got a few more webinars to go before the end of the year. So yeah, let's make this a good one. So our guest, George, he is head of digital strategy at Impression. They're an amazing agency with a bunch of awards to their names. And his talk is one that I think is going to really strike a chord with a lot of certainly a lot of creatives in the webinar this morning. How to know what you don't know when creating campaigns. So this means we're looking at the side of marketing that a lot of us are scared to sort of hang our hats on. It's the sort of safe place to build a campaign is on the data. When you're going to sort of report things to your boss, you can say, well, here's the data, and you can sort of really lean into that. But there are assumptions that we have about our audiences and our customers that we can't always put numbers to, but they can be really, really valuable. So George is going to help to explain how you can take those assumptions and turn them into optimization opportunities, and therefore build better campaigns, get better results, and be a better marketer, which is why you're here. So hopefully that sounds good. So as I say, there's going to be a short presentation and then Q&A in the sort of second half. So if you like somebody's question, you want that one answered, give it a thumbs up and it'll rise towards the top. And then finally from me, that most of you who turn up on a regular basis will know that the reason we can run these webinars is because we've got amazing sponsors, and each week we like to sort of just give a special shout out to one of them, and today that's Third Light. So they've supported us for a long time, and they're a software company that helps teams collaborate. And I think with people working from home so much, that's been a much harder thing in recent times. And so their file sharing and management software is like super searchable, and really helps people get work done. Their client list is bonkers. They've got people from AS Roma to the Albert Hall. So if you need your stuff organized, like these are the guys to go and see. So have a look at Third Light. We've also got huge thanks to Impression, Cambridge Marketing College, Fiverr, Gravity Global, Redgate, Brand Recruitment, Content Cow, and Geosk, which rhymes with kiosk. So yeah, if there's any questions, then let me know. I'm going to stop waffling because you're all here to see George, and George, I know, is going to do a smashing job of filling your brains with knowledge this morning. So I shall hand over to George, and then we'll catch up on the Q&A afterwards. Over to you, George.
Cool. Thanks very much for the introduction, James. Let me just share my screen. If you can let me know when you've got that, James, that would be great. Perfect. Cool. So yeah, as I said, thanks very much for the introduction. And it's great to be speaking to everyone today. As James mentioned, my name is George Gangar, and I'm the head of digital strategy here at Impression. And the role of our team really is to work with our clients to understand their business objectives and use data and insight to help achieve them. Now, with my very mysteriously titled talk today, I'm hoping to achieve two things. The first, and possibly the most important one, is to make you glad that you got up early, depending on where in the world you are, before work potentially, to dial in. And I'm very grateful to you for doing so. And secondly, to provide you with a practical exercise that you can hopefully apply when developing strategies of your own, regardless of the size of your business. And hopefully we can have a little bit of fun along the way. Okay, so let's jump into it. How do we plan digital campaigns? Well, when planning digital campaigns, as we've already mentioned, the focus is firmly on the data, and rightly so. I'm sure we've all heard and probably spoken ourselves about the importance of being data-driven and insight-led when it comes to creating digital strategies. And that's absolutely true. Of course, we should do our due diligence and ensure that we're making decisions that are, to a greater or lesser extent, based on evidence. However, whilst we tend to create strategies based on the data that we do have, the data that we don't have can be just as valuable, but often gets overlooked. There's also often a lot more data that we don't have than we do have. The reality is, no matter how much we know about our customer, our product, our channels, all of our strategies are based on assumptions. And as we've mentioned in this talk, what we're going to be talking about is how we can not only identify those assumptions, but turn them into optimization opportunities that will help us hopefully improve future campaign performance and ultimately meet those business objectives. Okay, so now I'd like you to humor me for a moment as I regress back to my former self as a young and impressionable philosophy undergraduate, whilst I talk to you about this fantastically eyebrowed person called AJ Ayer. So AJ Ayer was a member of a group called the Logical Positivists. Now, I'm not going to go into what the Logical Positivists had to say on things because it's far too early in the morning for all that, and I'd probably get it wrong anyway. But there is one thing that I wanted to talk to you about that Ayer had to say, and that's what he called the verification principle. And what the verification principle basically says is that something only has meaning if it can be verified with evidence. If a statement can't be verified with evidence, then it's meaningless. It's not even incorrect because it can't be tested. It's meaningless. According to Ayer, you literally might as well be talking nonsense. So that was what Ayer had to say on the matter, and it caused quite a stir at the time. Then this person came along, called Karl Popper, who came up with a new idea called the falsification principle. And this expands on what Ayer had been saying with the verification principle. And he argued that for a statement to be considered meaningful in the scientific sense, then it must be able to be tested and conceivably proved false. So the classic example of this is the hypothesis that all swans are white. So according to Popper and the falsification principle, this statement has meaning. It's not necessarily correct, but it has meaning because in theory, it could be proved false by observing a black swan. Okay, so if you're currently wondering, what the hell does all of this have to do with planning digital campaigns? Then that is a very fair question. And again, I thank you for humoring me. But I do think we can apply elements of these principles to the way that we go about building digital strategies. And what I'm going to do now is try to explain what I mean by that. And to do that, I want to ask a question. And that question is, if we put together a strategy or a plan and execute it, how do we know if our strategy was the right one? So one thing that we might jump to is something we've already mentioned a couple of times, our business objectives. If we execute on a strategy and meet our business objectives, then we must be doing something right, right? Well, yes. To an extent, it's true to say that if we meet our business objectives, we're probably not going to be hugely unhappy about it. But at the same time, we know that many different things can impact our ability to achieve our business objectives. You know, macroeconomic factors like the housing market, unemployment, or a global pandemic can all play a massive role in our performance, even if our strategy had a lot of merit. So it might be overly simplistic just to judge our strategies based on our ability to meet our business objectives. You know, if we want to take an extreme example, if you were running a digital campaign for an airline company at the start of the pandemic, it doesn't really matter how good your strategy was to begin with. It was always going to be pretty impossible to meet your original business objectives. Now, I know that is a pretty extreme example, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there isn't a perfect relationship between the validity of your strategy and your overall performance. Don't get me wrong, it's pretty damn important, but it's not the only thing to take into account. And to understand why, I think it's helpful to consider what strategies actually are. So fundamentally, I'd argue that a strategy is just a collection of ideas. Now, as best practice, we'd always say that you want those ideas to be aligned to your business objectives and based on insight. And those ideas can cover a range of different things. You might have ideas on what creative messaging is going to work best, or who your priority audience is. Ideas on channel mix, budget, and pricing are probably all going to come up too. But the point that I really want to make is that no matter how good your insight or your data, the chances are that a lot of these things, or at least large elements of these things, are going to be based on assumptions. And that doesn't have to be a problem, as long as we always maintain an awareness of the fact that that's what's going on. And that can be quite a difficult, counterintuitive thing for us to accept. And a lot of the time, I think we try to brush over the fact that these big assumptions are being made. And actually, that can do more harm than good. And personally, I find that the best way to maintain that awareness is to reconceptualize these things that make up our strategies, not just as ideas, but as hypotheses. And the key difference here is that whilst we still want our hypotheses to be aligned to our business objectives and based on insight, what we also want is for them to be measurable with a clear KPI. If we think back to the hypothesis that all swans are white, the reason that this statement had meaning was because there was a clearly defined way in which it could be measured and evaluated. It still might be wrong, but the point is that we have a way in which we can find out if it is. And I think we should apply the same logic to our digital strategies. Okay, so here's another way to think about it. First, we start with an insight. In other words, we start with the data that we do have. From that insight, we develop a hypothesis. In other words, what we think is going to happen. Then we run our activity and get some results about what actually happened. And this is the data that we didn't have before. And then from those results, we decide what we want to change for the next round of activity and how we can optimize based on what we've observed. In other words, the results from our first round of activity become the insight for the next and form the basis of a new hypothesis. So what we're basically saying is that the difference between what you thought was going to happen, which was your hypothesis, and what actually happened is the room that you have to optimize. And from going from your insight to your results, you're going from the data that you did have to the data that you didn't have and making sure that you're using that in your next round of activity. And taking a structured approach to that is a very small change you can make, but one that I believe can have a massive impact on the overall performance of your activity. Okay, so I appreciate that, slightly ironically, we've been taking quite a hypothetical approach up until this point. So what I'd like to do now is talk you through a practical exercise that I've used previously to help people formulate hypotheses. So in the past, I've run a training program for digital strategists, and we'd go through all sorts of different training sessions and interactive workshops to teach them how to go through each stage of a planning process. You know, all the way from interrogating a brief, conducting market research, building out strategic recommendations. It was a pretty detailed program, and throughout its duration, participants would be tasked with responding to a dummy brief. And we often picked something fun like planning for the launch of the new iPhone or something like that. The whole thing lasted about 2 to 3 months. And we'd get to the end and people would have built out some really impressive and detailed digital strategies. You know, lots of slide decks, lots of frameworks, all the good stuff that we love. And then as one of the final exercises, we'd say to them, okay, now summarize your strategy in just 5 bullet points. And at first they'd look at you, probably thinking, are you serious? I've just spent months putting all of this together, and now you're asking me to summarize it all the way back down to just 5 bullet points. But we'd say, think about the 5 key ideas that make up your strategy. You know, it's the classic elevator pitch style question. You have 60 seconds with the senior stakeholder, and you need to explain what you're recommending we do. And then we'd say, okay, now take those ideas and fill out this table. So here's what we want you to do. We want you to tell us what insight was that idea based on. So why are you suggesting it in the first place? What was the data that you do have? What did you know? What hypothesis you're making with that idea? So what do you think is going to happen? And how you're going to measure whether or not that happened in actuality. And often we'd get something back like this. So when we conducted, I'm taking the example of the iPhone launch here, right? But really, I think this could work with any size of business. The one thing that came back was that students were going to be a priority audience for this campaign. That was something that always got surfaced by the trainees. And the insight that they found was that according to market research and consumer polling, students over-index for being what was referred to as Apple brand fans. So the hypothesis off the back of this was that if you target students with your digital campaigns, they're going to drive the highest number of sales and the lowest CPA. And to measure that, really straightforward, you're just going to look at the overall sales volume and CPA of that audience versus your other audiences. It's really straightforward, which works well. We've got an idea that's based on an insight and can be translated into a hypothesis with a clear measurement methodology. And the key thing is that if this hypothesis proves to be true, then one thing we might do off the back of it is focus our efforts more heavily on students the next time around. You know, there's different things that we could do. We might run more creative that's targeted specifically at students who are going off to university, or we might emphasize the fact that we offer a student discount. We might allocate more budget to platforms that we know that students are more present on. So things like, I don't know, Snapchat or TikTok. There's all sorts of different things that we could do if we saw that our hypothesis that students drive the highest number of sales and the lowest CPA proved to be correct. But if the hypothesis proved to be wrong, then we can do a similar thing. And we've still gained information there. We've still gained data that we didn't have before. And so what we might decide to do is shift our budget to a different audience. We might have had another insight that we decided not to go with this time, that parents, for example, were a key audience. And that was something that came out. Parents in the build up to Christmas buying their children new iPhones was a very key audience for them. So what we might decide to do, if actually this hypothesis was wrong and it wasn't students, but it was parents who drove the highest number of sales for the lowest CPA, we might reallocate our budget to that audience the next time around. But again, that hypothesis being proved right or being proved wrong becomes the insight for the next cycle of activity that we're going to run. And the whole cycle starts again. So this works well because there are potential optimization opportunities that we might unlock as a result either way. But the point is that it will go either way, or it could go either way. But sometimes we'd go through a process like this. So idea, insight, hypothesis, and then we'd get to measurement and they'd be unsure. So if we take this example, the idea is that we should promote the iPhone as an aspirational purchase. So these are actual examples that we got from the trainees. And okay, cool. That's based on the insight that from our research, we can see that our audience cares about the social status that is gained from having the latest iPhone. Okay, so that works. And we can even make a valid hypothesis out of it. And that is that consumers will buy the iPhone if it's seen to be a luxury lifestyle accessory. So again, that could be proved, theoretically could be proved, could be right. But when we get to measurement, we'd ask, how are you actually going to validate that hypothesis? You know, it's a pretty tricky one. First of all, you need to determine whether or not consumers consider the iPhone to be a luxury lifestyle accessory. And then you need to determine the overall impact that having such an opinion had on that consumer's propensity to convert. Okay? Those are the two things you need to establish in order to prove that hypothesis one way or another. Now, I'm not saying it's an impossible hypothesis to test, but it would most likely take a lot of consumer surveying, possibly some brand studies, maybe some focus groups to answer, which is absolutely fine, except you've not mentioned any of that in your proposal so far, and you've not allocated any budget for it either. So at this point, what we might do is go back and reflect on whether or not the potential impact of validating this hypothesis would be worth the overall cost to do so, which it might be. But if it's not, and we're not actually going to go through the cost required to measure it, then when it comes to optimization, it's going to be relatively meaningless to us because it's not giving us any additional information because we're not proving it or disproving it either way. So coming back to what we were saying about something needing to be able to be proven or disproven or verified or falsified either way, that's what we're talking about when we're saying that needs to happen in order for us to use it in our optimization. So by going through this process for each of the key ideas that you're putting forward, you should be able to refine them into a set of clear and measurable hypotheses. And it should help shed light on those areas that might sound good initially, but on further inspection are unlikely to help you with your optimization efforts once the results start coming through. And that might be because the way that you're structuring it won't yield conclusive results, or is very unlikely to yield conclusive results, or you're not actually going to be putting the relevant measurement solution in place to get to an answer, whether or not your hypothesis was right or wrong. And you know, the hypotheses and measurement solutions, they don't need to be completely groundbreaking. If they are, then great. But in fact, I found that going through this process actually helps refocus your efforts onto the fundamental building blocks of your strategy that are going to really impact your success. So, as I said, that's the practical exercise that we often go through when training people in the best practice of digital strategy. And hopefully it's something that you might find useful to do yourselves. So now what I want to do is bring it back to our question. How do we know if our strategy was the right one? Well, it's really difficult. As we said earlier, there are a huge number of factors that can impact the success of our strategy. So looking at overall performance alone might not be the best way to do it. But what we can do is break our strategic recommendations down into a few fundamental hypotheses and evaluate whether or not those were in fact the right recommendations to make in the first place. In my opinion, the best thing about this approach is the fact that it allows us to get things wrong, as we know why they're wrong, and then we can use that to improve the next time. My favorite example of this is forecasting. Pretty much the only thing we can be certain about when going through a forecasting process is that the forecast is going to be wrong. But that's okay, because it's impossible to predict exactly what's going to happen when your marketing activity goes live. And pretending otherwise, and this is really the key thing for me, pretending otherwise is only going to do more harm than good. You know, if you're building your business strategy around a forecast that you know is likely to be wrong to a greater or lesser extent, but you're treating it as gospel, that probably isn't going to end very well. So the key is remaining aware of the fact that it probably will be slightly wrong. If we can remain aware of the things that we don't know and keep track of the assumptions that we're making, then even if things don't go exactly as planned, we might just be able to get things a little bit less wrong the next time around. Thanks very much.
Cool. We all good? We're done? That's great. Can everybody hear me? I've taken myself off mute. Yeah, that's super useful. One of the things that I'd got going around my head was thinking about if you're in a small business where you've got quite a small customer base, it may be like a B2B business where you've got high value individuals, and you're getting feedback from 2 to 3 of those people. That's obviously a really small pool of sort of insights. Is it something that you think is still possible to do, and what's the do you see customers taking those risks sometimes on assumptions on really, really small data sets?
Yeah, so I think it's a really valid question. I think small data sets is a really key thing that we have to deal with. I think ultimately it's about knowing when you're making the assumptions and then being able to make a decision on whether or not you're happy making a business decision off the back of it. And sometimes you're just going to have to, right? I mean, it's the classic thing. I bring it back to forecasting quite a lot because I worked with a business recently that was brand new website, never been launched, never launched before, never had any previous activity, and ultimately, and asked us to put together a 5-year forecast for what that was going to achieve. And that is so hard to do, right? It's so difficult to do anything without that data. But you've got to do something. you've got to, what's the alternative? We can't not launch the new business. We can't not press ahead and try and launch a new business without a solid forecast, just because we're not 100% confident in it. So we do have to make the assumptions, and that I think is the really key thing for me. We have to make these assumptions. So let's stop pretending that we don't. Let's stop pretending that we know exactly how things are going to work out all the time. Let's acknowledge the fact that we don't know and set up some ways that we might find out in the future.
Yeah, I think that sometimes maybe comes with confidence as well, because I think certainly having been in a sort of a CMO role before myself, and you've got, the top person asking you for, all the answers. They just expect you to know what's going to happen, and you come up with a plan, and there is that pressure to just to base it on facts and deliver ideas that are 100% foolproof. And it's to actually say, well, this we don't know, this is going to be an experiment, I think is a really good good bit of advice.
I think just to build on that quickly, I think understanding when it does inevitably not go exactly as you're expecting to, understanding where the change has been. So again, if you're doing a forecast for, let's say, paid search, and you're predicting a certain amount of return on your investment, you're probably going to have to forecast a certain level of CPC, for example, or a certain level of click-through rate to get to whatever you think your performance is going to be. Now, if afterwards you can come back and say, right, well, the reason that we didn't perform quite to the extent that we did was because actually our CPC was higher than we expected it to be. Well, then that gives you a jumping off point that says, well, maybe competition is higher than we initially expected. What should we do with that piece of information, and where do we go from there? But I think it's when you don't know why you've gone wrong, that's when you really start to struggle.
Yeah. No, that's good advice. Okay, well, we've got some open questions here at the moment. First one is from Simon, who said, "What is your go-to place for market research and intelligence?"
It's a really good question. So there's a few different tools that I like to use. I think first of all, it's always worth mentioning the free ones, because there's a lot that you can get out of them, right? So although I'm sure most people will be familiar, I do want to make it clear that you don't necessarily need to just go and spend money on on a shiny new market research tool. Like if you want to look at things like consumer demand, for example, then Google Trends search volume data is probably the best place to go for that, to get a very quick snapshot of what's been happening to consumer demand over time. Equally, you can use that to look at things like share of search. So if you have a number of competitors, you can look at what the brand search volumes are for you versus your competitors. And there's been a lot of research done by people like Les Binet, who have shown that there's a very close correlation between overall brand search volume compared to your competitors and overall market share. They correlate very, very closely. So that's one place that I would look if you want to try and get to a free view of market share without having to invest heavily. In terms of some of the paid for tools that I've used, I use SimilarWeb Pro quite a lot, which for those of you who aren't aware, it basically uses data from a number of different places to track how people, or to model how people behave across the internet. So you can enter in different websites and look at the way that people behave when they come to and leave that website. So something that's quite helpful for is if you have a competitor set and you want to see how you acquire your traffic versus your competitors, you can build out what's called a custom industry, and it will show you, okay, on average, your competitor set gets 20% of its traffic from organic, it gets 30% from direct, and it gets 10% from social. And you can then compare your own figures to that, and it helps spot some potential opportunities for where you might not be exploiting certain channels to the best of your ability.
And that's called SimilarWeb.
That's called SimilarWeb, yeah.
That sounds like a hugely powerful tool, certainly for competitive industries.
Yeah, it is very useful. And then from a more an audience perspective, another tool that we've used quite a lot is called Global Web Index. And Global Web Index basically works, it's like a survey data. So they'll do a massive consumer survey, similar to the way that YouGov or people like that will do it, but it's more heavily focused on online behavior and your online audience and where they are and how they behave. And so you can go into it and you can build out audiences based on demographic attributes, interest affinities, whatever it might be, and then find out more about them. So, if you said, if we take the students example, you could build out a students audience in there and then look at the way that they consume media online. So you might see that they over-index for, well, in fact, the example of them over-indexing as Apple brand fans, that was a piece of data that came out of SimilarWeb. Or you might see that they use TikTok a lot, or whatever it might be. But that's a really useful tool as well.
Yeah, and that leads on to sort of Fiona's question and links to my next question, which was, how much is SimilarWeb? But Fiona said, is it worth paying for deep customer research data, or better to A/B test your own?
So it's a really good question, and I don't think there's one answer to it. So I appreciate that a slight cop out, but I guess here's how I would evaluate whether or not it's worth it, and try to think about the potential value that it's going to unlock for you. And if you can get things through A/B testing, you can probably get quite far A/B testing, especially if if your product is completely new and completely unique on the market and there's no existing market research around it, okay, then maybe not. But you'll probably be able to find something that someone else has done for a similar product in a similar industry, and use that as a jumping off point for your A/B testing. So I would always start with that. And then if you really can't not feeling like you're making much progress, then I think maybe potentially is worth investing in some deeper research. But I do think that you can get a long way just A/B testing and looking around on Google, verifying your sources and making sure you're doing your homework without having to invest in it.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that Joe and I found, which has changed the direction of what we're doing at the Marketing Meetup, is we sat down for 2 days and talked to people in the community. Obviously, we've got an established brand now, but having those conversations and just asking questions directly to our audience was super useful. Nothing that we could have got from any tools, and it sort of changed the direction of the activity we've been doing going forward. So yeah, it's but it'd be really good to look at some of the sort of data that you can buy in as well and see whether that affected what we did. But no, that's great. Okay, so Laura has asked, in terms of your 4-point model, idea, insight, hypothesis, measurement, would you include SMART objectives?
So when we talk about SMART objectives, I'm assuming we're talking about the model where it's like measurable. I can't remember the acronym.
No, neither can I. Oh, yeah, God, you would.
Yeah, I know broadly speaking what the purpose of it behind it.
Someone drop it in the comments, because it's too early for me to remember.
Yeah, I think the main point behind it is that they're achievable, and you're making a very clear definition of what success is going to look like against that objectives. There we go, specific,
measurable, achievable, relevant, time bound. There we go.
Yeah, exactly. So I think just being very, very clear about exactly how long you're going to be testing something for, what the KPI is, like what the measure of success is, again, specific, making sure they are realistic. So yes, I think that works as well. I think that the main thing that I'm saying is that it's about taking a structured approach to that. I think when it comes to the measurement methodology, having a very clear understanding of what needs to happen for this to be proved true and what needs to happen for this to be true false, and making sure that you are being specific and those are relevant objectives that you're setting, then I think, yeah, absolutely, that can work as well. But I would very much emphasize like the insight and hypothesis stages as well, just making sure that you're being really clear about that in advance.
That's cool. There was a question that was actually put in the comments by Jane, saying you gave a great example of the measurement, sales volume, and CPA. Do you need to provide more detail around this? Often we are encouraged to add plus 10% in sales, but this is based on nothing. What would you advise? That's a tricky one.
Yeah, I mean, I would only add more. Well, I guess that 10% plus 10% in sales, if that's what you need to achieve in order for it to be successful and viable for your business, in order to take that recommendation forward, then yes, I would include that. Personally, I tend to focus on like the relativity between two things. So in that example that I gave, we were talking about an audience, and we we're talking about prioritization, which is like a relation between two things, right? So we were saying that students were the priority. And the reason for that was because we thought that relative to the other audiences, they would have a higher sales number and a lower CPA. So for me, I would probably find it quite difficult unless I had a lot of data to give like a really solid estimate on the number of sales and exactly what the CPA was going to be. But I would expect it to be higher than like in relation to the others. I'd expect it to perform better. And ultimately, you know, even if we don't hit the sales target, it's not quite high enough. It's probably still going to be the one that we're going to focus on if it's higher than all the rest. So yeah, I try to make it relative, just because again, I don't know what I would get to that sales estimate from.
Yeah. So we've got a question from an anonymous attendee that says, how many people are involved in your evaluation of your business, the idea, insight, results, measurement model?
How many people?
I guess it depends on the client, really.
Yeah, it completely depends. I mean, I think that the main reason that I wanted to focus on this today was because I think it can apply to sort of all scales of business. So, you know, if you're talking about just a business that someone set up on their own, I see no reason why one person, in fact, it'd probably be a lot easier in a lot of ways for one person to do it all themselves. Sometimes what you do find is that, you know, you have larger businesses where you'll have a strategy team, you might have a measurement team or an analytics team, and that split will be sort of primarily focused around sort of objective setting and strategic direction. Will sit with the strategy team, and then the measurement and evaluation will sit with the analytics team. I think that can work as well. I think the more different chefs you introduce, you know, the more mixed up it could get. But yeah, I'd say it really varies. But I do think it can apply to businesses of all sizes.
That's cool. I love the fact that Amy started her question with kind of an impossible question, which I love. She says, but how much time should you spend on deciding your strategy? You can spend what seems like forever questioning it, but do you ever set a time frame and a cutoff to set your objectives?
To set your objectives, I thought I had a good answer until the objectives came in as well. Well, I think objectives really depend on so if you're talking about a time frame in which you need to achieve your objectives, that really depends on the requirements of a specific business. You know, like how quickly do you need to be profitable? How much money do you have? How much can you afford to lose? All of that kind of stuff. So I don't know exactly how long you would need to give yourself to set to meet your objectives. In terms of setting a strategy, though, I do find it quite counterintuitive when I've worked with some massive brands in the past who will basically, you know, finish one campaign and then start building the strategy and the plan for the same campaign, but the following year. And it's almost like 6 to 9 months in advance. And I do understand why that happens sometimes, and I get it. But personally, I think that particularly with things like performance estimates and forecasting, like it's hard enough to get that right really near to the time. Like think about the weather. How hard is it to forecast the weather like the day before, let alone like 2 weeks before? And it's the same with forecasting performance, right? So personally, when I try and work through strategies with clients, I say like absolute maximum that we want to be starting in advance of your launch, ideally, is 3 months. But really, I'd rather do it in sort of 4 to 8 weeks. It's more work in a smaller amount of time, but I found that that's kind of, for the scale of business that I work with, which is kind of varied, but normally like medium sized, like that's the most amount of time you can get to do as much work as possible without being so far from the launch date that everything's changed by the time you go live, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I also think from having worked with, a customer of mine that I've worked with for 3 years, you kind of start off with a strategy, sort of a core brand strategy. And over time, it's just tweaked and tweaked and tweaked. And so I don't think in some cases there isn't always an end to having a strategy that everybody sticks to. And it's, because things pop up, don't they? Coronavirus, for instance, things can sort of knock you off course, and you do need to sort of change what you'd originally planned for. So yeah, so if anybody's got any more questions, drop them in the Q&A, but I think that's pretty much all the ones covered off. It's a really nice sort of simple process to sort of take people through, and it's probably something that we don't do enough. I think as marketers we can be guilty at jumping in at all the sort of sexy creative stuff, and sometimes it's good to have some of that structure to sit around it. And I think that that process that you took us through today was super useful. So thanks for doing that. So yeah, if you've got where can people find you, George? Where's people good to connect?
If people want to get in touch, then LinkedIn is probably the best way. I'm pretty responsive on there, so please do feel free to reach out if you want to talk about anything further.
Cool. Oh, and actually, there's another question that just came in about other resources other than sort of SimilarWeb. Have you got some maybe go-to ones that people can take from this webinar and go and, whether they're freemium type products, whether that's like Google Analytics, or like what are the ones that if you were starting a florist tomorrow and you'd got only a couple of quid together to get it going, what would be the ones that you go and grab first of all?
So I think, like, fundamentally, as I said to begin with, like you don't need to go out and spend money on these tools, at least not, you don't have to right at the start. It's not going to hurt, but you don't have to. I think, like, if you're running like some Google Ads activity, or you're running like some Facebook ads, or whatever it might be, the actual insights that you can get out of those tools on its own is going to be hugely helpful to you. And I don't think we maximize them enough. So things like Keyword Planner or the Audience Insights tool in Facebook, that, like, those are such good tools just to give you a starting point, a jumping off point, help you form some hypotheses, right? So if you're just starting out and you don't want to go and spend any money, I would look no further. Well, I would look at those to begin with. Some other things that you can look at is, like, Think with Google is quite a useful just bank of like market research documents. So that is somewhere that, again, if you are in a specific industry, you kind of just have to hope that they have one on your industry. But that is another place that you can go and get like a bit of market research from for free. Other things that are sort of more paid for, I guess the other thing, as you mentioned already, like Google Analytics, I think like doing something simple like linking your Google Analytics to your Google Ads and actually using it and paying attention to what you're seeing in there sounds really obvious, but it should be done. But outside of that, depends what you're looking for. If you're looking for things like an easy way to measure consumer sentiment, then there are social listening tools like one called Brandwatch that I've used in the past. And that will essentially allow you to look at the overall positive versus negative sentiments around either your brand names or like certain, whatever keywords that you want to type in. It scrapes mainly Twitter to get that information. And then there's things like SEMrush, which work quite similarly to SimilarWeb, but are slightly cheaper. But yeah, there's loads of them. So those are the ones that jump out to me. I actually don't use anything more than SimilarWeb and GWI at the moment, and the free ones. And I don't really feel like we need to, not yet anyway. But Brandwatch is probably one that I would look at in the future because it is quite unique, because it gives you that consumer sentiment view, which you might not get in real time from the other tools.
And I guess flooding yourself with too much information at the start can almost create a problem for you. Whereas actually, if you get a bit of insight based on some of the tools that you're talking about and test it and go through that process, actually it's about getting the ball rolling, isn't it?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, the most valuable thing for you is going to be to see how your own activity performs in real life. So all of these tools, they're just giving you jumping off points. So, they are useful to an extent, but ultimately it doesn't say, if SimilarWeb says that something's going to work and it doesn't work, your own activity says it doesn't work, then it's more important to go with what you're seeing your own activity deliver in the real world. And I think that's kind of the point here. Like, if you build a hypothesis, you're giving yourself more data to use in future, and you don't need to pay for that, or at least you have to pay for a tool to give you that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. George, what an absolute legend. Thank you so much. We've got a couple of more webinars before Christmas, I think 2 or 3 left, and there's some great ones lined up. So all I'd ask is that if you could please go and tell your friends about it, your colleagues, if you've enjoyed the session, go share it with people. This community is growing and it's wonderful, but it's you that helps us grow, and it's you that makes it so special. So really appreciate everybody coming along today. And George, thank you so much. And yeah, Joe will be back in the hot seat next week, and we'll go from there. So make sure you go and thank the sponsors as well. Go and give them we'll send out an email shortly afterwards with all the links. So yeah, thanks a lot and have a great day.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks, George.